system that will allow a diversified economy like the U.S. economy or the Canadian economy or the British economy, German economy, to work consistently well. It's like they're like cars with somebody putting chewing gum in the gas line, and all of a sudden they choke up and start to go slow, and it doesn't make any sense. We established during the G20 thing a website called victoryfortheworld.net, and I hope we're going to be able to use it in the next few months to see if we can't get somebody, hopefully in the United States.
About that, Paul.
Well, we're organized a letter writing campaign to President Obama and to Prime Minister Stephen Harper and to the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, and we sent thousands of letters and emails, but it's too little, too late. That's really what the books were for, was to sort of promote that kind of discussion, but it was too late. And so I'm saying to my colleagues who believe the same kinds of things, we're not going to give up. We're just going to take a few days off this summer and regroup and then start fighting again. And so we put up this website, which is called Victory for the World, all one word, .net, and we will be revising that and bringing it up to date, and hopefully people will go there and get involved in the history of money and what has to be done to make the system work. Just a word on leverage. When the Bank of England was chartered back a little over 300 years ago, it was allowed a leverage of 2 to 1. The king borrowed all of the money that was subscribed for the bank, £1,200,000 in gold and silver, and he paid them a good interest rate for it. And then to show his appreciation, he said you can now print, print, an additional £1,200,000 and lend it to your rich friends at high interest. Well, then over the years, in the early days of the 20th century, the U.S. Federally chartered banks had to have a gold reserve of 25%, which meant they could lend the same money 4 times. In Canada, when I was young, we had to have a cash reserve of 8%, which they could lend the same money 12.5 times. But today, and leading up to the meltdown, the banks were allowed to lend the same money 20 times. And that's just legalized fraud. That's all it is. I mean, imagine if you had a room to rent and you rented it to 20 people and had a contract to collect rent from each one of them for the same room.
Right.
And it's the same principle. And so bank leverage has got to be reduced. And in my book, I recommend bringing it down to 3 to 1. There's a chapter on money there that I think is very relevant to the times and to the problems that we've been discussing. And
it's greed, though, Paul. It's greed. That's why these percents are so high.
Well, of course, and the collusion of politicians who don't understand the system and are not willing to take the time to find out, to learn about them.
How is Stephen Harper's popularity these days?
Well, it's so-so. I'm not sure that he would win a majority if he calls an election now. We have a different system than you do, as you know, and
right.
He could call an election just about any time now if he wanted to. And I think if he thought he could get a majority, he would, but I'm not sure he would, because there are a lot of people who have reservations about him and government policy, and certainly our government's very inconsistent on this monetary thing, and they're starting to cut back on a lot of programs. And the provincial governments are raising taxes because so much has been downloaded from the federal government, so many responsibilities, and at the same time they're starting to spend money on other things. They'll spend $9 million for new jails. Well, why don't we spend the money constructively and get people back doing useful things and getting a life for themselves?
I want to talk a little bit when we come back, Paul, about Wernher von Braun and what he told a friend of yours about some astronomical expenditures on arms and why, what's going on there. That's a major issue. And also next hour, we'll take your phone calls with Paul Hellyer, author of this latest work, Light at the End of the Tunnel. I'm George Norrie, back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. On our next Coast to Coast program, we're going to have a floating format show. We're going to be talking about the Voyager spacecrafts 1 and 2, launched in 1977 with Stephen Pine. And then later on, Jeff Belanger joins us as we talk about Picture Yourself Legend Tripping, UFOs, Monsters, and Ghosts. So get ready for that classic Coast to Coast show. When we come back, more with Paul Hellyer and his light at the end of the tunnel. The next hour, we'll open up the phone lines for you to talk with him on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, what is the story of Dr. Wernher von Braun? Tell me about this one.
Well, the person you were alluding to, of course, is Dr. Carol Rosen, who was a friend of mine. And she told me that she worked very closely with von Braun for some time, and they discussed what we call the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. And von Braun told her that as far as the industrial-military complex is concerned, they have to have an enemy at all times in order to justify the astronomical defense expenditures. So he said, first it will be the communists. And he said, then it will be the terrorists. And then after the terrorists, it will be the extraterrestrials. And it all makes sense because this is sort of the way the world is unfolding. And presumably, a lot of these expenditures were really designed to deal with phantom enemies. And we, frankly, I think we've got our priorities all wrong. We just spend too much money on the military and too much money fighting each other and wasting money on ammunition and so on, and not enough building a better world where everybody has enough to eat and a shirt on their back and a roof over their heads. So this is interesting because some of the literature, the UFO literature, tells how Eisenhower appointed Nelson Rockefeller to look at the ET file, and that somehow in the process he set it up in such a way that it would come under the influence of private enterprise. And as a result of that, Eisenhower felt that he had lost control of it. And it was on that point, on that issue, that he made his famous statement and said, beware of the military-industrial complex, that they may be doing things that are not in the interest of the United States.
Big mistake doing that, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, this is one of the ways that they've maintained secrecy, too, because they've transferred a lot of the files to industry. And consequently, when you try and get files under the Freedom of Information Act,
sure,
that they say, well, we don't have them. And they don't tell you where they are, but it sort of...
Paul, you also talk about religions and that, they're literally killing each other, and that's got to stop as well. How does that fit into the equation here?
Well, that's the third thing. The three essentials that I mentioned in the book for the future of the world are, one, the global warming. And it is probably the most important in the sense that we do something about that right away. And, of course, where the extraterrestrials come in, and I have, as you know, the longest chapter is on the ET presence. The title of the chapter is "We're Not Alone in the Cosmos." And it's a good primer for people. If any of your listeners have friends who are skeptics, this would be a good chapter for them to read, to learn a little bit about the ufology and exopolitics and that sort of thing, and to perhaps spark their interest a little bit in doing more research and getting to know more about it. But one of the things that comes out of it all, I think, is that according to almost every report, is that the ETs are more spiritual than we are. And so we really have to emulate them, not only in technology, but in spirituality. And so one of the three essentials that I say, the first one was global warming, the second one was changing the banking system, make it financially possible to do the transition fast enough to be of some use. And the third thing is that the major religions who have been fighting each other and killing each other for millennia are going to have to stop doing that and work together to build what I call the kingdom of God on earth, which I define as a world where all the children have food to eat and water to drink and a little bit of education, some health care, and a roof over their head and a shirt to wear, and where they have enough education to find out, what their potential is and maybe go on to make a real contribution to society at large. And that should be the priority of all of the religions, because one of the things I point out in the book is that they have more in common than any of us realize. And if you dig beneath the surface, and if you go back to original manuscripts, you strip off a lot of the differences, which been described. The former Congressman Mark Siljander, for example, wrote a book called Deadly Misunderstanding, which is based on really misinterpretation of the differences between the Bible and the Quran, and this kind of thing. And so I say that that is part of the wrong set of priorities, that the priorities have to change and not only move away from the military, but move away from unnecessary wars and tribal differences and start cooperation so that everybody can have a bit of a life and have something to look forward to and with their kids and their families. And I think that we can get some inspiration from the ETs in this area as well as we have in technology.
Well, let's make the assumption for a moment that nothing changes, that the power brokers that be continue to grab, do what they do, make money, and they just care about themselves. Let's assume nothing changes. What happens?
Well, this is speculation, but first of all, one of the things I mentioned, that the ocean temperatures are rising, so the areas that spawn storms are getting larger. So you're having bigger and bigger and more frequent tropical storms than ever before. And Katrina was just sort of a forecast of things to come, of worse things to come. And then, of course, the ocean levels are rising. And if they rise enough, then a lot of land is going to be inundated, as I think I said before. And this is going to displace millions of people. The temperatures are going to rise so that parts of the United States are going to be extremely hot. And it wasn't me that said it, but there was an English scientist who forecast that quite a few Americans would move to Canada. And terrible things happening all over the world. This really terrible tragedy that's happening in Pakistan at the moment. I saw on the news the other night that global warming may be a factor in that the ice is melting, the snow is melting in the mountains faster than usual. And so the snow, melting snow is adding to the volume of water that came down in the monsoons. So the extremes seem to be becoming more extreme. And this is bound to have a devastating effect on the quality of life for all kinds of people. And then, of course,